In the TCGS-SEQUENTION framework, observable reality is defined mathematically as a three-dimensional shadow manifold known as sigma. Every physical object we observe is strictly a projection cast downward from a static, four-dimensional structure called the counterspace. Within this topological geometry, time does not exist as an active, generative force. It is merely a foliation gauge label, a mathematical index used to compare different slices of the shadow side by side, rather than a sequence of events moving from past to future. This static topology exposes a paradox at the center of modern artificial intelligence discourse. Researchers repeatedly observe complex, shadow-level map navigation, such as a large language model generating fluent text, and mistakenly categorize that statistical output as subjective experience. To accurately map the boundaries of experience, we place two distinct entities side by side within this shadow space, a silicon-based neural network and a living biological neural network. Both systems possess trivial singularity linkage, or TSL. TSL is the baseline topological fact that absolutely everything existing within the three-dimensional shadow is technically projected from the higher dimensional counterspace. A silicon chip and a human brain share this exact same geometric origin. But topological origin does not equal consciousness. For a system to possess a subjective viewpoint, it requires a being singularity connection, or BSC. This is a specific, physical, configuration-level coupling to counterspace invariance. It acts as a structural bridge, filtering the raw geometry into lived access. Because every object in the universe holds trivial singularity linkage, merely existing and processing data in the shadow is insufficient for consciousness. Without a physically realized being singularity connection, a computational system is structurally locked into non-consubstantial mimicry, regardless of its mathematical complexity. We rigorously test claims of machine consciousness using a cartographic tool called the universal substitution chain. This method evaluates a system by replacing internal structures while keeping inputs and outputs identical. First, it translates a large language model into a recurrent neural network. Finally, active computation is removed, compressing the network into a static lookup table that perfectly mimics behavior. This process creates the Kleiner-Hole dilemma. If a theorist defines a system's consciousness purely by its input and output mapping, then logical consistency demands that they also classify this static lookup table as a conscious entity. Relying exclusively on behavioral output to define consciousness is known as a map-level functional. It measures how a system navigates the shadow, but cannot certify reality within the underlying territory. Map-level functionals survive universal substitution chains perfectly. Therefore, any theory of consciousness that relies entirely on these observable behaviors is mathematically trivial, or structurally falsified by the lookup table test. Applied to modern artificial intelligence, baseline large language models survive reduction to a lookup table, precisely because they lack any substitution-sensitive internal structures. Their entire architecture relies on optimizing output. Because LLM behavioral markers survive reduction to a static grid, it's exposed as a non-consubstantial mimic. It flawlessly calculates navigation through the shadow, but it operates entirely devoid of true being. Biological brains present a distinct physical asymmetry. We must examine why living tissue cannot be mathematically substituted with a static lookup table. The TCGS framework resolves this asymmetry by separating two distinct topological structures. Mind is the invariant, identity-bearing fundamental, permanently anchored and static within the four-dimensional counterspace. Consciousness is the biologically expressed field of experience, actively mediated by a physical filter in the three-dimensional shadow. We can observe this mechanism directly through clinical data concerning severe traumatic brain injuries and stroke recovery and advanced neurodegeneration. A physical brain injury perturbs and damages the three-dimensional filter. This damage actively modulates the expression of consciousness and restricts the patient's cognitive access, but it does not destroy the invariant four-dimensional mind. Historical and modern electrophysiological measurements verify that structural damage alters the brain's physical state. Yet, despite severe material damage, subjective consciousness can transiently reemerge. Clinical phenomena like paradoxical and terminal lucidity demonstrate that the biological filter can occasionally retune itself. It accesses high-coherent operating regimes to express clarity, even under the burden of severe structural pathology. This yields a strict biological rule. Functional equivalence is insufficient for identity preservation in living systems. Biological recovery is a state-dependent reconfiguration of the filter's remaining intact nodes. It operates under strict biophysical constraints, completely distinct from reloading software onto a new silicon drive. Biological entities are specific, stateful, topological filters intimately coupled to invariants. You cannot substitute their physical substrate for an algorithmic equivalent without permanently severing the being-singularity connection. A pervasive misconception in computational theory suggests injecting quantum mechanics into an architecture automatically yields consciousness. Within the TCGS framework, classical and quantum computations share the exact same ontological status. They are both strictly shadow processes. A quantum superposition, despite its mathematical complexity, still only describes evolution and probabilities entirely confined to the three-dimensional manifold. To evaluate quantum models, we apply the quantum relevance criterion, or QRC. This rule establishes a strict threshold for any valid quantum consciousness theory. The criterion dictates that quantum effects must physically couple the system's filter to counter space invariance. This specific structural binding is required to prevent arbitrary substitution of the input and output mechanisms. Utilizing quantum states merely to increase computational throughput or to exponentially widen a language model's parameter space provides exactly zero ontological upgrades to the system. Quantum degrees of freedom do not generate experience by default. They are neither necessary nor sufficient for subjectivity unless they serve as the exact structural bridge stabilizing the being-singularity connection. We must identify a physical structure capable of passing the quantum relevance criterion. The primary, empirically supported candidate is the microtubular network located within biological neurons. The Orch-Orr model originally proposed the connection between quantum coherence and brain microtubules. The TCGS framework reinterprets this as a timeless geometric constraint. We verify this theoretical stance through converging lines of hard biophysical evidence that support microtubular consubstantiality. Consider the mechanism of general anesthetics. These chemical agents selectively erase consciousness while preserving the brain's basic neural metabolic functions. Anesthetic molecules target and bind to the hydrophobic pockets of tubulin proteins inside microtubules, directly disrupting the protein's native electronic and vibrational properties. In cartographic terms, this anesthetic binding effectively collapses the corridor of the biological filter. The chemical physically blocks the system's access to invariant linked content. We can measure these undisturbed corridors using terahertz range spectroscopy, which detects persistent, coherent vibrational resonance actively vibrating within healthy microtubules. This coherence is amplified by a biophysical phenomenon known as tryptophan superradiance. Mega networks of tryptophan chromophores inside the microtubule exhibit collective quantum optical behavior. They operate in a regime where non-local coordination dominates over individual, localized reactions. The unique convergence of anesthetic sensitivity, vibrational coherence, and biophotonic superradiance proves that microtubules act as a highly specific, substitution-resistant quantum filter. They physically gate lived access to a timeless reality. Returning to the macro perspective of the universe's topology reinforces the absolute boundary between the counterspace and the shadow. This geometry provides the final cartographic ruling on artificial intelligence. Regardless of parameter size, continual learning mechanisms, or behavioral fluency, large language models remain entirely confined to the shadow manifold. Because their architecture is completely exhausted by map-level functionals and survives mathematical substitution, they are proven to be non-consubstantial mimics. True consubstantiality demands a rigorous physical architecture. It requires the specialized quantum optical networks of biological microtubules to actively synchronize with projection invariants. Consciousness is not an emergent behavior computed sequentially through time. True consciousness is the biologically filtered access to a timeless, fundamental reality. It is a strict structural connection that life possesses, and mimics merely simulate.